Mindhunter is a Netflix thriller series about a small unit of FBI agents who revolutionize the way law enforcement hunts for serial killers by using psychological profiles drawn up by interviewing dozens of incarcerated killers and figuring out how their minds work. But how real is the show? Mindhunter centers on the early days of the FBI's behavioral science unit, which, in the show, is more or less made up of agents Holden, Ford, and Bill Tench, with Dr. Wendy Carr and one other agent rounding out the division. While the show acknowledges the behavioral science unit was started before Ford and Tench began their interviews, by the time they do, they're more or less all there is. The BSU was actually formed in 1972 when agents Howard Teton and Patrick Mullaney, neither of whom are in the show, began using elements of criminal psychology to teach law enforcement groups how to analyze criminal behavior. It was a response to the growing wave of serial killings and assaults in the 1970s.
The question is not only why did the killer do it, but why did the killer do it this way? We are now talking about psychology.
Their small unit, originally made up of just 10 agents, would by 1976 include agents John E. Douglas and Robert Ressler, the inspirations for Ford and Tench respectively, who would begin compiling their central database of serial offenders, which is of course where the show comes in. As is often the case in adaptations, things are streamlined for the sake of simplicity. Arguably, the central character of the ensemble cast of Mindhunter is Holden Ford, the young hostage negotiator, whose radical ideas about criminal psychology more or less kick off the whole pursuit of interviews of serial offenders. He's largely based on real-life FBI agent John E. Douglas, whose book, Mindhunter, Inside the FBI's Elite Serial Crime Unit, was the inspiration for the show. He was one of the very first criminal profilers, and he's written several books on the topic. Like Ford, Douglas is a soft-spoken Brooklyn native who worked as a hostage negotiator and instructor at Quantico. Like Ford, Douglas realized serial killers were not simply monsters to lock in a dungeon, but potential wellsprings of insight and information that could lead to the capture of other serial offenders.
Sir, the insights afforded us during these visits may possibly help us identify the person responsible for the attacks in Sacramento and help prevent others.
Just as Ford uses his relationships with incarcerated killers to glean understanding about active killers, Douglas consulted with Ted Bundy for information that led to the capture of the Green River Killer. Many small details on Mindhunter come from Douglas's recollections, including Charles Manson sitting on the back of a chair to seem taller than his interviewers. Holden Ford's partner and the second primary character on Mindhunter is the straight-laced Bill Tench, whose more conservative demeanor presents a stark contrast to the younger, less predictable Ford. Tench is largely based on FBI agent Robert Ressler, the man who is generally credited with coining the term serial killer in conjunction with Douglas, much as Tench and Ford are seen developing the term on the show.
Series of killings.
Serial murderer?
Serial killer.
It's better. Let's see if it sticks.
Ressler came to work at the FBI after finishing his military career with the rank of major and a master's degree in police administration. Shortly after joining the Bureau in 1970, Ressler was able to convince them profiling could be a legitimate and effective tool for hunting killers, and by the middle of the decade, he and Douglas were interviewing incarcerated killers and building a centralized database. He developed relationships with such notorious killers as Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, and John Wayne Gacy even gave him a personalized painting as a gift. The entire running plot about Tench having an adopted son who is definitely going to become a serial killer is completely fictional, however. Rounding out the trio of protagonists is Dr. Wendy Carr, a psychology professor from Boston who tries to rein in Ford's wilder and more unconventional notions with something at least resembling professionalism and intellectual rigor.
When we empathize with the psychopaths, we actually negate the self. We deny our own beliefs about decency and humanity, and that can be very dangerous.
Of the three main characters, Dr. Carr is the farthest from her real-life inspiration. But she is nevertheless loosely based on a psychiatric forensic nurse researcher named Ann Burgess. According to the real Burgess, Mindhunter is pretty accurate.
The cases are pretty much on target with what we have from data.
Burgess's role, like Dr. Carr's, was to bring methodology, research, and structure to what Douglas and Ressler were doing. Like Carr, Burgess is from Boston, but rather than a psychologist, she is a professor of psychiatric health nursing. Burgess suspects this change was to make the character's career a little more understandable, as most people don't properly understand nursing. Two major changes made for the show, however, are that unlike Dr. Carr, Burgess never moved to Quantico, and Burgess is not a lesbian, a character change that was apparently a source of some humor for her son. While Ford, Tench, and Carr are the central characters of Mindhunter, the real star of Season 1 is the first subject of their interviews, Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. Actor Cameron Britton wore shoe lifts to make his own 6-foot 5-inch frame a little closer to Kemper's 6'9" stature. His character is a fascinating one, as his intellect, eloquent, and soft-spoken nature belies the hideous truth of the despicable things he's done.
So I got a claw hammer and I beat her to death. Then I cut her head off.
Many viewers were left wondering how close Mindhunter's depiction of Kemper is to the real-life co-ed killer. The answer is pretty close. All of the details Kemper gives in interviews regarding his life are not only true to what happened, they're often in the killer's exact words taken from interviews he gave in real life. In contrast to Ed Kemper, whose near-pathological desire to help law enforcement led him to readily confess every detail of his horrific deeds, Ford and Tench have a much harder time with Jerry Brudos, known alternately as the Lust Killer or the Shoe Fetish Slayer. It's not until the agents give Brudos a pair of shoes that he opens up about his crimes, and even then he only talks about them in oblique terms, as if he were talking about someone else. Brudos' entire recounted history on Mindhunter is accurate, from his fascination with women's footwear beginning with finding a pair of high heels in a junkyard at age 5, to his outwardly normal domestic life hiding his darker fetishes and grisly desires.
It's tricky when you're married. You either have to deny yourself or keep a private space.
As recounted in the show, Brudos' first victim was a young encyclopedia saleswoman that he lured in by pretending to be interested in buying a set of books. Brudos would go on to collect trophies from his other victims, including clothing and body parts, and he would photograph their bodies and dress in their clothes. Another interesting detail from the show occurs when Brudos fixes Ford's broken tape recorder. Brudos worked as an electronics technician before his spree began. One of the more memorable killers in Season 1 is Richard Speck. He's notable for being a disgusting creep who brags about the sexual nature of his crimes and throws a bird into a fan. But it's the way Ford initially gushes at the prospect of meeting him, along with his conduct during their interview, that's especially memorable.
It's like meeting a movie star.
The real Speck was notorious for killing 8 nursing students in Chicago in 1966. He left one surviving victim who was able to identify him by the Born to Raise Hell tattoo that Ford makes special mention of.
The tattoo is kind of legendary.
The details of his crime, including how he forced his way into the apartment with a gun before brutalizing the women and, somewhat ironically, forgetting about the one who had answered the door, are all accurately recounted on the show. The nature of Speck's crimes was different from many other killers and helped draw the distinction between serial killers and spree killers.
Who else you talking to?
Like I said, people who've been convicted of similar violent crimes.
I'm not like them.
One of the most notorious killers of all time doesn't make an on-screen appearance on Mindhunter until Season 2, partly because his infamous reign of terror ended just prior to the events of Season 1. That killer is David Berkowitz, better known as the Son of Sam. Berkowitz caused panic in New York City by shooting 6 people in 1976 and 1977. He sent cryptic letters to the police in which he claimed to be acting under the orders of his neighbor's Labrador Retriever, which was possessed by a demon. But on Mindhunter, Berkowitz admits the demon angle was all just a story to get attention.
They all bought it, David. Didn't they? Even the shrinks.
The real-life Berkowitz did admit to exaggerating many of his claims, and John Douglas contends he was never fooled by the whole Son of Sam thing. Additionally, Douglas and Ressler did actually consult Berkowitz over the BTK letters, just as Ford and Tench do on the show, as Berkowitz had also sent letters during his spree. Throughout Season 1, Mindhunter would often cut seemingly unrelated scenes featuring an ADT salesman who eventually is shown to exhibit some pretty disturbing behavior. While his name is never said and he doesn't interact with any of the main characters, serial killer enthusiasts undoubtedly recognize this figure as the infamous Dennis Rader, aka the BTK killer.
BTK.
He's a new animal. Lots of interesting contradictions.
The real Rader was a seemingly average family man working for a home security company in Wichita, Kansas, while also being an active church member and Boy Scout leader. This was, of course, a cover for his disturbing secret life in which he carried out killings involving bondage and women's clothing. It was because of his killing methods that he gave himself the name BTK, for bind, torture, kill. But even though the BSU started investigating Rader in Season 2, the real BTK wasn't captured until 2005. The backbone of Mindhunter's second season is the hunt for the so-called Atlanta child killer, who is eventually alleged to be Wayne Williams. If anything, Mindhunter actually undersells the scope of Williams's crimes. Between 1979 and 1981, dozens of black children and 2 young men were kidnapped and killed, their bodies dumped in various places around Atlanta. This reign of terror threw the city into a frenzy, and the families of the victims demanded justice and the apprehension of the killer, or killers, as many believed. Despite the belief within the community that it was likely a member of the Ku Klux Klan, John Douglas argued the killer was probably black, as he would have been less likely to be noticed in black neighborhoods, and because serial killers rarely cross racial lines.
African American.
Drives a police-type vehicle, lives with parents or a close relative, owns a dog.
A curfew was imposed in the city for children under 17, after which young adults began disappearing instead. Wayne Williams's capture happened in real life pretty much exactly as it did on the show. After a story in the Atlanta newspaper revealed fibers and dog hair had been found on some of the bodies, the killer changed his methods. Investigators were then able to narrow the focus of their search. After 4 weeks of waiting, a group of officers on stakeout heard a loud splash in the early morning of April 22, 1981, and a station wagon driven by 22-year-old Williams attempted to flee the scene. 2 days later, police found the body of a young man downstream from the site. Williams was questioned, and fibers and dog hair in his home were matched to those found on the bodies of some of the victims. The Wayne Williams case was the first major public effort by John Douglas to prove the efficacy of the methods being developed by the BSU. In addition to his profile of a young black man proving correct, he also successfully advised prosecutors to keep Williams on the stand as long as possible and to goad him about his failures. It provoked a hostile reaction on the stand that ultimately led to his conviction. However, Douglas was officially censured by the FBI for publicly stating Williams was the likely perpetrator of a large number of the killings, not unlike Agent Ford finding himself in hot water for similar statements. Just as depicted on Mindhunter, Williams was only convicted of killing 2 adults. He was never even charged with the deaths of any children.
In all investigations, reach a point when you've done all you can. So for now, we are suspending all 29 investigations, having arrested our prime suspects.
Unlike most of the killers interviewed by Douglas and Ressler, Williams never confessed to any of his crimes and, in fact, denies responsibility. In 2019, the mayor of Atlanta reopened the child killer cases in order to use modern technology to finally determine a definite killer and provide closure for the families of the victims. Check out one of our newest videos right here. Plus, even more grunge videos about your favorite shows are coming soon. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a single one.